Now, if you have a Bible handy, I'd like you to turn with me to the passage, which is 1 Corinthians and chapter 9. Do you know, I was only thinking on the way this morning, like when you're driving along and your brain is thinking about stuff. And I was thinking about, wouldn't it be interesting if we had a book, a simple book, a straightforward book, which explains to us everything we really need to know about church life and everything we would really need to know about being a Christian, and yet, of course, we sort of have one. It's here. There we are. That's it. It's just there. And this doesn't mean that everything that we could ever think about is in the Bible. Far from it. I mean, it doesn't tell us anything about going to Asda supermarket. I've looked everywhere. It doesn't tell us anything about using the telephone. Nothing in here about using the telephone. Nothing about buying a Renault car is in here either. And yet we have this amazing book, don't we? Which is an ancient book. It's at least 2,000 years old, the latter part of it. And yet it is so incredibly relevant for today. And we're going through this letter of Paul, the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 9 we're in today. And in this particular chapter, he completely unpacks the whole of what's involved in supporting the Lord's servants in their ministry. And you think, well, how interesting. Do you know, most Christians aren't even aware that there's a whole chapter about how to support God's servants in the Bible. This is it. But it's also about other stuff too. There were people in those days, not very nice people. They might have professed to be Christians, but they would say things like this. Take no notice of Paul. He's just that preacher that's a bit short and a bit spindly, covered in scars, half crippled. And when he talks, it's not very clever. It's not very articulate. It's not very beautiful talk. It was crude talk. So take no notice of Paul. He's not a proper apostle. I like Peter. Peter's big and strong and woolly hair, black hair, and he's outspoken and brings the judgment of God down upon the congregation. That's the sort of preacher I like. Or I quite like Apollos. Apollos is a Jew, very upright. He comes with his Jewish robes on. And he quotes from the Old Testament perfectly. Not that Paul couldn't do that anyway. But he quotes for, and I like Apollos. And then in the latter days, there were people like a man called John, who they called him the Silver Tongue. He was a beautiful... Have you ever heard a really beautiful speaker? Some speakers are absolutely incredible. They used to say of George Whitefield that even people who weren't believers, when he pronounced certain words, it was worth going just to hear the pronunciation of words. When he said Mesopotamia, in fact, one of the greatest actors of his day said he would give all the world to be able to say Mesopotamia in the way that George does. See, interesting, isn't it? These people were extremely articulate, not like the Apostle Paul. He was this little short chap that was probably quite thin and a bit bangly-legged, and he'd been beaten up so many times, and he'd been left for dead a couple of times, and he'd been through so much suffering in his life. Now, we don't really like the Apostle Paul. I mean, who does he think he is anyway? There's 12 apostles. He's not one of the 12. And so Paul has to write. And he has to explain, look, I am an apostle. He's done that already in this book. But even in this particular passage, he starts off again. He says, am I not an apostle? In fact, in this passage, Paul speaks about his own ministry. This passage is about Paul's ministry. He's describing his own ministry, and he asks 4 rhetorical questions. Anybody know what a rhetorical question is? What would you say a rhetorical? It's a funny word, isn't it? Rhetorical. Well, a rhetorical question is a sort of question that you ask and you don't expect anybody to put up their hand and say the answer.
It comes back to you.
It's a rhetorical question, so it's part of his speech, but he's not asking anybody to answer it. He's asking him to think. That's all. And he asks 4 questions. The first one is, he says, am I not an apostle? And they're thinking and they go, well, yes, Paul, you are an apostle. He says, am I not free? And he answers, yes, Paul, you are free. And we'll talk about what he meant by that. He says, have I not seen the Lord Jesus? Where did Paul see the Lord Jesus? He saw him on the road to Damascus. Yes, he did. Well done. He says, are you not my work in the Lord? This church wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for Paul. Paul went from Philippi down the road through Berea, through Thessalonica. He went down to Athens. He preached there alone. He went up north into Corinth. When he got to Corinth, he went to the synagogue, preached the gospel, and lots of people became Christians, and the church in Corinth was founded. These people were people that came to know the Lord as a result of Paul's preaching. He says, so his question then, first question, am I an apostle? Yes, Paul, of course you are. Am I not free? This means, am I not financially obliged to my hearers? Yes, you are financially obliged to your hearers. Yes, of course you are. Have I not seen the Lord Jesus? Yes, I saw him on the road to Damascus. Are you not my work in the Lord? Yes. We are your converts, would say the Corinthian Christians. He says, look, in verse 2, if I'm not an apostle to anybody else, I'm an apostle to you, because the seal of my apostleship are you in the Lord. They are the proof, the evidence that Paul is an apostle. Now there were some that doubted or even denied his apostolic credentials. Paul says, look, if I'm not an apostle to anybody, then I am to you, because you are the proof of my ministry. You are the people that came to know the Lord as a result of my preaching. And then he goes on in verse 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7. He says, my answer to those that would examine me in this is this. Have we not power to eat and drink? What he means by power there, he doesn't mean have I got the strength to eat and drink. He says, have I not got the authority to be given food and drink by the believers because of the ministry I've got? He says, have I not got authority to lead a sister, to have a sister and support her too? Or a wife and support her just like the other apostles? Now we know that Peter, he had a wife, didn't he? Contrary to what the Roman Catholic Church would say, Peter had a wife, and we know that. Why do we know that?
When she was not well, Jesus goes to heal her.
Well, it was his mother-in-law. You see, you don't have a mother-in-law unless you're married, do you? Right, so he had a mother-in-law, you know. We have kept down the number of mother-in-laws in our family very effectively. So he says, or I only and Barnabas, have we not power to forbear working? What he means is this, look, because of our ministry, right, because of our ministry, we don't have to do secular work. We can be supported, right, in our ministry by the saints. The believers can support us. He said, let me ask you a question. He says, who goes to war and pays for his own wages? Who does that? Nobody does that. Who plants a vineyard and then doesn't eat the fruit? Well, nobody does that. If you plant a vineyard, then you're allowed to eat the first grapes, right? Put your hand up if you're a shepherd. If you're a shepherd, are you not going to drink the milk? Are you not going to have the cheese? You see, because that's one of the reasons why they had sheep, so that they could have the milk from the sheep and the cheese, and then of course they could have the wool and they could have the meat. So then, he says, is it only me and Barnabas that can refrain from profitable employment? Okay? What soldier goes to war at his own expense? It doesn't happen. Who plants a vineyard and doesn't eat any of the grapes? Who has sheep and doesn't drink the milk? Nobody does that. Paul is saying that those who preach the word are able to be financially remunerated for their work. In fact, in the New Testament we're told that those who labour in the word and in doctrine shall receive double honour. That means a double wage. You see, there are certain types of ministry that lend themselves to self-supporting. Certain types of ministry, if you're an evangelist, various types of ministries can be self-supporting. But those who labour only in the word and doctrine, they don't have a garden. They can't plant vegetables because they're just busy in the word and in doctrine all the time. So then, verse 8, so I say these things as a man, or does not the law say the same thing? It is written in the law of Moses, thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treads out the corn. You see, what used to happen in the olden days is that they would have an ox walking around a large millstone. And they'd pour the grain into the top, and he would go round and he'd crush the grain. But little bits of grain would drop onto the floor where he was walking, and he'd put his head down and help himself to it. After all, if he's treading out the corn, is he not allowed to eat some of the corn? Of course he is. In fact, in the law, it was forbidden to put a muzzle over the mouth of an oxen who's treading the corn. Why? That's cruel, isn't it? That's proper cruel, isn't it? To not let the ox have some of the benefit of his own hard work. He says, does God care for the oxen? He says, yes, of course God cares for the oxen. But he's also saying it for our sakes as well. Those who labour should have the benefit of what they do. Those that have an orchard should be able to take the first apple. See the point? Those that plant the garden vegetables should have the first carrot. See, it's all the same, isn't it? So then, when we get down to the latter part of verse 10, he says, for your sakes, no doubt it is written, that he that plougheth should plough in hope, and he that thresheth in hope shall be partaker of his hope. What's that mean? Well, what it means is this. If you're a ploughman, put your hand up if you're a ploughman. No, there's no ploughman here. If you're a ploughman and you go out ploughing the fields, you plough in hope. Hope of what? You hope to be a beneficiary of your own hard work. That's what you hope. Okay? And those who thresh the corn hope to eat some of the bread. Don't you? They hope to eat some of the bread. Okay, he says, if I have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we participate in your carnal things? In other words, we've given you spiritual blessings. Can we not have a loaf of bread to eat because we're hungry? That's what he's saying. You see, the man who ploughs the field looks forward to the benefit of the harvest that he will receive. The person that sows spiritual things looks forward to the benefit of the things of the body. There are other people who benefit from you, so why not us? What he's saying is, look, other people take money from you, so why not us? It's very powerful arguments, isn't it? And then in verse 12 he says, nevertheless, we have not used this power, but we suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. And some people may say, well, how on earth would that hinder the gospel of Christ? Well, I can think of one reason whereby, in Paul's case, it would hinder the gospel of Christ. You see, Paul was a Pharisee. When he got saved, he became a saved Pharisee. He didn't stop being a Pharisee. And when he went along to the synagogue, he'd sit with the Pharisees, because that's where the Pharisees sat. He wouldn't sit with the Sadducees. He'd sit with the Pharisees. And all the groups of the Pharisees, they had lots of traditions. One of them was that they all had to be married men. But another one of the traditions is this. They all had to have a trade. And they all had to work at their trade. They were what you would call the amateurs. Now, the scribes were the professionals. They got paid to be a scribe. But all the Pharisees, they earned their own living. And Paul couldn't sit amongst the Pharisees, could he, if he's getting paid to do the preaching? So he says, no, I don't want the money. I want to sit with the Pharisees. I want to reach the Pharisees. And I can't reach the Pharisees unless I become one of them. Now, this is a lesson for missionaries. In fact, the whole of this is a lesson for missionaries. And we're going to talk about that even more in a moment. He says, I have not used this privilege of being paid because we suffer everything so that the gospel's not hindered. That's why he didn't have an income. Normally speaking, he would. Verse 13, do you not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple? Now what's that mean? If you were a priest in Israel and the money goes into the pot, that money's put in the pot for you so you don't starve. That's what the money's in the pot for. He says those priests in the temple, they get benefit from the money that's given. And those that wait at the altar are partakers of the altar. Now let's think about this for a minute. Here comes the priest, he's approaching the altar, and you've just given a sacrifice, and he takes the meat and he carves it up and he puts it on the wood, and it's turned into a burnt offering before the Lord. That must have smelt beautiful. Imagine that massive piece of meat burning there. And the priests were allowed to take a knife and carve off a slice and eat it. Did they? Yes, they did. They were allowed to participate in the sacrifice being made at the altar. Now what Paul is saying is this. That's what preachers of the gospel can do. They should have the right to be able to be fed for the ministry that they do. Verse 14, even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. So God in the same way has ordained that those who preach the gospel should be supported financially for their work. Verse 15. But I've used none of these things. Paul says, I didn't want to do it that way. Neither have I written these things that it should be done unto me. I haven't asked you to give me money, and I'm not asking for it, he says. It would be better for me to die than any man should make my glorying void. What he's saying is this, I'm in a good way, because you can have pride in a good way. He says in a good way, I'm actually proud of the fact that I don't take any money for my ministry because of the particular circumstances that God has brought me into. And if you gave me money, he says, I wouldn't be able to be proud about it anymore. So Paul is reminding them that he's not used this privilege, nor has he requested it. He says, I would rather die than make my boasting empty. He says, even though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory in. For though I preach the gospel, verse 16, though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of, for necessity is laid upon me, for woe unto me if I preach not the gospel. So some of the words that Paul uses is a bit tricky. He says, my daily needs come upon me constantly. It's the same as you. Your daily needs come upon you, don't you? He says, my daily needs come upon me constantly. He gets hungry when there's nothing in the larder. That's what he meant. He says, I have the necessities of life. I need bread to eat. Okay? But what a terrible thing if I didn't preach the gospel. Wow. That is the greatest necessity of my life. Verse 17, for this I do willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, a dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me. Some of these phrases are a little bit tricky in English today. Paul says, I have this arrangement of my own choice. And if I am supported, it is against my will. If somebody sends me money, Paul says, it's against my will. I'm not asking for it. I don't want it. You say, I have a stewardship of the gospel committed unto me. So what is my reward then? My reward is this, is that when I preach the gospel, I make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. So he's saying, what is the reward for me preaching the gospel? My reward is simply this, that I make the gospel free to my hearers. That's what I wish to do, he says. Now, Paul is not saying that everybody should do this. He's saying this is my personal conviction. This is what I believe God wants me to do. Verse 19, for though I am free from all men, yet I have made myself a servant unto all, that I might gain more. Now this is where Paul talks about his missionary enterprise. This is a passage that every missionary should sit up and take notice about. In fact, this is a passage that every evangelist should also sit up and take notice about. Because he's going to lay out the pattern for being a missionary or an evangelist. He says, I'm free from everyone, but I make myself a servant to everyone. Well, how do you do that, Paul? Well, in the next verse, he says, to the Jews, I made myself a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, I became as one under the law, that I might gain those that are under the law. If you want to reach the local cricket club for the gospel, then you go and you become a member of the cricket club. You're not going to reach them if you don't. If you want to reach the people that live up on this estate, you go and live on the estate. You see the point? He says, to those that are outside the law, that don't have the law, I live as if I have no law. And yet he says, not without the law of God completely. I'm under the law of Christ, that I might gain those that are outside of the law. And notice again, he says, to the weak, I became weak, that I might gain the weak. Wow, what a lesson. You might have upon your heart somebody that you would love to reach with the gospel. Become like them. If they're a Jew, when you're with them, be like a Jew. If you're trying to reach a Gentile, when you're with them, then be like them in every way, if you can. Do you know, somebody said, it's a beautiful expression, and I think this ought to be the motto of every missionary or evangelist. He says, when you go to preach the gospel, you are to be like them in every way possible, and in all the other ways you teach them to be like you. Have you got that now? I'll say it again. He says, when you're reaching out with the gospel, you are to be like them in every possible way, but in all the other ways you teach them to be like you. Now that's what you call close quarter, close contact evangelism. He says, so that to the Jews, I remain a Jew, so that I might convert the Jews. To those that are under the Mosaic law, I remain a law-abiding Jew, so that I can win them for Christ. Okay? To those who are Gentiles, I am like as one who doesn't have the Mosaic law. This doesn't mean that I'm lawless, but that I'm under the authority of Christ, so that I might win those who are outside of the Mosaic law. To the weak, I become a weak person, that I might gain the weak people. Now this is the motto of Paul in evangelistic ministry. I am, he says, all things to all men, so that I might by all means save some. What an utterly life-transforming. I was talking to a missionary one. In fact, somebody asked me just a few weeks ago, they said, I want to become a missionary. I said, good. Excellent. I said, well, go to the mission field and become exactly like the people. If they're poor, you become poor. If they don't have a TV, you don't have a TV. If these people eat cereal, then you eat the cereal. If these people wear cheap clothes, you wear the cheap clothes. Don't turn up in a Land Rover with all of the cust of Western society. That's not going to be any good. You've got to become in every way like them. And in all other ways, you teach them to become like you. That's what you do. You should really be able to walk into a city and not find the evangelist. Why not, you say? He should cut his hair like the local people. He should wear the clothes of the local people. He should live in a hovel like the local people. He shouldn't have a Land Rover. None of the locals have got a Land Rover. Now you see what real close contact missionary work is. You know, in the days of the early brethren, there were men and women who were earls and countesses and dukes. And you see, the early brethren movement stretched right through the whole of society. It reached the very height of society, like, I can think of names, and it reached right to the very bottom of society. And what the brethren used to do, now just watch this, it's lovely. They would all have horses and carriages in their normal life. After all, if you're a duke, you have a horse and carriage, don't you? A big one or a really posh one, polished by all the servants. Yeah, but when they went to the Brethren church, they left the carriage 2 miles away. And they walked the streets with the poor people and came into the assembly. That's what they did. And very often, some of the brethren, they'd stop at a wall. They'd stop at a wall on the way. And he got beautiful, lovely white cuffs. And they just push them across the wall, just dirty them a bit. Make them look not stand out too much amongst the poor. Now that is humility. That's humility. And when they were amongst the people of the assembly, they didn't flash their wealth. They didn't flash their wealth. They just mixed in amongst the poor. When you saw them in the church, you didn't know whether they were a duke or not. How'd you say? He says, to the weak, I am weak. He's saying it in this sense. He says, to the poor people, I'm like a poor man. But to the clever, I can hold my own. Of course I can. He says, I am made all things to all men, that I might use all means to save some of them. And this I do for the gospel's sake, that I might be partaker thereof with you. So Paul is not saying that he puts on a pretend cloak to suit his hearers. He's not saying that at all. What he says is this. He says, I'm not chopping and changing, being a Jew and being a Gentile. He remained a Jew all the time. But he realized that to meet certain people, he had to meet them where they were. Now, all of you are different people. You're all different. One of you is a teacher, one of you is an engineer, one's this, one's that, one's a policeman, one's this. Do you know what? You can reach the people that are like you. You can reach the people of your age. You can reach the people of your race quicker than anyone of any other race. You can reach the people of a similar language to you, of a similar trade to you, of a similar status in life to you. So go and reach them. Become like them in every way that you can, so that they'll listen. So that they'll listen. And then in verse 24 he says this, know you not that those who run in a race, they all run together, but one gets to the end and gets the prize. He says, run that you may obtain. I love that. Run that you may obtain. He says, we're all in a personal race. He says, we're all in the race. He says, but one of us is going to get the prize. One of us. As Christians, we are to run to obtain the prize. So when you get to that tape, the Lord Jesus is going to be standing there and he'll shake you by the hand and say, well done. Well done. You see. And he says, and everybody that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. This is the idea of the wrestling match. That's what they used to have in those days, the wrestling matches. And they'd go into the ring. He says, if you're striving to master your opponent, be temperate in all things. Don't get yourself drunk the night before. That's not going to help you to win the race. That's not going to help you to beat your opponent. He says, and they do it to obtain a Stephanos. It's a laurel crown that goes around the head. Doesn't last very long. Anybody seen one of these things that goes on a... Well, people put them at funerals, don't they? It's like a laurel thing. You come back a week later and you'll find it's not there. It's just crumbled to dust. He says, we fight in the arena to obtain an incorruptible crown, a crown that never fades away. I therefore so run, not as uncertainly, so fight I. He says, I'm in a fight. He says, and I am telling you, I am not biding my time. I'm in that fight and I'm going to win the fight. I don't fight like somebody boxing the air. Like shadow boxing. I'm not fighting against shadows. I'm fighting against an opponent. And I bring my body unto subjection, lest after I've been in the fight, I'm disqualified. Just recently on the Olympics, it's been very sad, hasn't it? People have won gold medals. And then 2 days later, we found that they broke the rules. So the medal's taken away. He says, I don't want to have fought the fight and then lose the battle. Don't want that. He says, I don't want to be a castaway. Now the word castaway there, by the way, there's nowhere in this passage where Paul is talking about being a Christian, becoming a Christian or losing it. You can't lose being a Christian. So he says, I run to win the race and I fight to win the fight. Okay? And I do this, and to do this I keep my body in check. In case, after I've preached to everybody, I am then disqualified in my ministry. Paul says, I live so that God will not find me useless in his service and set me aside. It's very sad, this does happen, that certain evangelists and Bible teachers have been set aside by the Lord. I was set aside at one time. It's very tragic. It happens. It's possible, you see, to preach the gospel and then something happens in your life and you're put to one side. That doesn't mean it's forever, but they can be put to one side. Why? Because they brought disgrace on the Lord in some way and they just cannot stand in the pulpit and preach with something like that going on in the background. It can't happen. Paul says that's the very last thing I want. I keep myself very, very carefully in check so that after I've done the preaching, I'm not disqualified from the ministry. John Wesley famously said this, right through his life and especially at the end of his life. He said, Lord, may I not live to be useless. What a tragedy that would be in the Lord's work. And so to bring this to an end, Paul is not talking about his salvation. Some people think that Paul is saying that you might be cast away in the sense that his salvation's lost. But this chapter isn't talking about his salvation. This chapter, well, you've read it, is talking about his ministry. Okay? And Paul is saying, look, it's possible to do something that disqualifies me from my own ministry. And then I'll be set aside as an unfit vessel for God's service. And so the fear of the Lord and the restraint of the Holy Spirit and the guidance of the Holy Spirit should be upon each one of us as we seek to live a life that is honourable to him.